guys, it's so nice out. I decided to do the Viva out here today, so enjoy the beautiful weather. I know I'm behind, so this is week 23. The question was, why did the hippie movement turn violent in 1968? So, a little bit about the hippie movement that we need to look at is that, a lot of the critics of the hippie movement today actually were former supporters of it, and which is interesting, but they say that the hippies often stood for they were kind of like hypocrites, or they said they would do one thing, but then it was obvious that that's not what they were doing, or they would be kind of against it, like cultural diversity. So they said that they were all for cultural diversity, and that was a big thing for them. But most hippies were European and had a lot of European ideas. I hope this isn't too windy. I feel like it's gonna be too windy. So that was part of it. They also embraced the drug culture, and like we looked at last week, the quote tune in, turn on and drop out quote, it was kind of only applicable for the upper classes because they could afford drugs. But if you were lower class, you couldn't just like drop out of your job or life to do drugs, because then you wouldn't survive, or you couldn't have everything you needed. And another thing that they were big on is sharing land, and they wanted that. But then everything, I feel like this is gonna be really windy. Everything that they had or promoted was a very fashionable item, and it encouraged personal liberty, like we see with Ben & Jerry's ice cream. So that's just kind of a little bit about the hippie movement. But although the hippie movement is thought of as peaceful because of the aesthetic, it turned violent because political crises pushed the youth to violence. The questioning of core values led to no normative vision, and the drug culture had a lot of side effects, which led to the increasing of violence. So political crises that led the youth to more violence. So this 1968 is a really just like hopeless year, full of grief, a lot of assassinations, a lot of riots, and just a lot of people who promoted peace actually died. And so there was just this like kind of give up mentality that people had, and they just decided, if we can't be peaceful, we might as well be violent. So it kind of starts on April 4th. Martin Luther King is assassinated, and as we know, he promotes peace. Like, he is all about peace. And so once he dies, people think, well, he died from violence and he promoted peace, so we need to be violent, and there's no point in being peaceful if others are just going to be violent. So that was kind of the spark event that sparked everything else. So then we have, the student takeover at Columbia University, and they were doing that for segregation rights. So they take over the Hippie Manifesto, which is something that we read, basically promotes the idea that authority is bad and that we should hate authorities and overthrow. There we go. There we go. Overthrow authorities. Then we have the Paris riots, which is again more students, more young people protesting. We have on June 3rd, following by June 4th, June 3rd, Andy Warhol was assassinated. He was a really popular artist of the time, and he was actually killed by a feminist, which is just kind of a funny fact. So he is killed on June 3rd, and the next day, June 4th, Kennedy is assassinated, who is obviously very popular with the people and very popular president. And so his death promoted a lot of violence because, again, he promoted peace. And so when people saw that he was killed by violence, they didn't see the point in being peaceful, so they became violent. Then, we have July, and there's all these more riots, more violent riots in Cleveland. August, the Soviet invasion of Prague, and then we also have in October, there's student protests in Mexico City, and it's basically the youth is sick of peacefully waiting for things to change, so they decide to take action and become violent. And so all these events, you can tell through this whole year, it was either assassinations or violent riots or protests or whatever it was. The whole year was just full of these crazy political crises, and the main ones were really Martin Luther King and Kennedy being shot. So those really pushed people to violence. So Bernardine Doorhorn says, quote, "Tens of thousands have learned that protests and march don't do it. Revolutionary violence is the only way," unquote. And so she was, I think we're going to be talking about her a little bit more, but she was a part of Charles Manson's group. So very violent lady, very protesty lady, and so she just says, the only way to have change is to have violence. So moving on to point 2, the questioning of core values led to the reestablishment of a normative vision. So that was kind of all the political craziness of 1968, and then so that's kind of the political side, and then we have this kind of re-establishment of core values that comes along through music and cults, and just kind of into drugs, but mostly cults and music, that kind of question the normative values, and they're all violent. So this obviously leads to more violence, because if the normative is reestablished and the new stuff is violent, you're going to go towards violence. So in November of 1968, the Beatles come out with their White Album. This really changes the aesthetic of music. So one of the kind of values, core things of music is changed, and it's the first time that they use distortion in music. So if you listen to the song Helter Skelter, you can hear the distortion. And this song also influences Charles Manson, who is pretty crazy, to kind of explore his violent, crazy mind. So Charles Manson and his family, he was also a musician, but then he made a cult, and he was this leader of this cult, which mostly attracted women for some reason, and he basically had 100 followers who they were doing hallucinogenic drugs, and they lived in a communal living, and Manson basically claimed that he was a manifestation of Jesus and his prophecies. He prophesizes a race war, and so later Manson goes to prison in 1967, so just the year before 68, before all this violent stuff starts happening, for just some petty crimes. And then in August of 1969, all of his followers just start killing and assaulting people and stealing, and they use Helter Skelter for the reason of their crime. And there was even a murder where they wrote Helter Skelter on the wall, and so people all kind of started to connect the Beatles with Charles Manson, even though the Beatles, I don't think, supported Charles Manson's crazy ideas. So, because of 1968 and this questioning of core values, it just created this. There's no more normal, and so following with all the violence of the year and all the crazy political stuff that happened that year, and Charles Manson kind of gets these crazy ideas, and so the next year there is even more violence and killing and assaults and just craziness. People are just going back to violence because they don't have any more normative culture or normative societies that have like rules. So the cult also kind of, this is just a kind of a funny story, that Charles Manson's cult, they would sneak into people's houses during the night and they would like roll on the floor and like pretend to be worms, and then they would just leave. So that's kind of, I don't know, it's just funny. So also the following year, December 1969, we have the free concert, and so the Rolling Stones decide to put on a free concert, and they don't really plan this. They're just like, we're gonna play music and everyone's gonna come. So there's no security, there's no anything provided, and so the Rolling Stones hire the Hells Angels and they pay them in liquor, and then they pay them in liquor, and of course this is not a good idea. We already can tell that paying Hells Angels, a gang, liquor at a concert, they are probably all drunk and high, and they become really violent, and so they just start like stabbing people and killing people, and everyone just gets really violent, and it's just like this crazy violence and killings and just insanity at this free concert. And the Rolling Stones they just keep playing their music, and people are just dying, and they just keep playing along. So it's just it's a great end to the 60s. Through 67, 68, 69, all the hippies. 1969 ends in December with this murder-free concert. Pretty crazy. So, again, way to reestablish the normative craziness. Finally, the side effects of the drug culture played a role in the increasing violence. So obviously we know that in the 1960s, a lot of drugs were being experimented with, a lot of drugs were becoming popular to use, and drugs obviously put people in a weird reality. And so there's a lot of weird just cults and stuff like that make people kind of violent. So first we have the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and this is basically the hippie mafia, and they are big drug people, and they import drugs, and they actually stopped in 72 because there was so many drug raids with them, and obviously raids, they're violent, and so they just stopped because they were like, we can't take this killing and this stealing and everything. So people were violent to get drugs, and also because of the side effect of drugs. So we have the hippie mafia, and then we have the Ultima concert, the free concert that I talked about, with paying Hells Angels with beer to be the security, and also they were high because it was the 60s, and so this also led to violence, and that was obviously really, really violent. And then the last cult that we're going to be talking about is the Jim Jones cult. He was pretty weird. He moved to a commune, and then somewhere in South America, and he basically, everything seemed great, everybody was happy, and they were all living together in unity and all this. And later he actually killed all of his followers using Kool-Aid, and he put cyanide in the Kool-Aid, and they all drank it at once, and they killed each other. So they all died. Mass suicide. And this is just because of, obviously they were killed by cyanide, which is a drug, and then obviously they were hippies, and they were probably all high. And he really promoted socialism, which again we know comes out of the hippie identity. So Jim Jones says, quote, "If you're born in capitalist America, racist America, fascist America, then you're born in sin. But if you're born in socialism, you're not born in sin," end quote. So this is just an interesting view on how he viewed America, obviously, and socialism that he really wanted, which is interesting that he says fascist America, because we know fascist leads to socialist. So drugs, question mark. But yeah, so that's just Jim Jones' views on life and just how drugs really led to people being violent to get them, or being violent because of them, or dying because of them. So why did the hippie movement turn violent, you might ask, in 1968? Is because although we look at the hippie movement through a peaceful lens because of the aesthetic of it, it turns violent because of political crises which really pushed the youth towards violence, the questioning of core values, which led to no normative in society, and also the drug culture and just the side effects of drugs led to more increasing violence. Thank you.